1967, London, Royal Albert Hall. By the end of the night, Bob Dylan would do something so unexpected that even Queen Elizabeth II would fall into stunned silence. But it began with a single sentence whispered backstage by a woman who refused to worship legends. The hall was overflowing with anticipation, velvet curtains glowing under golden lights, critics in tailored suits adjusting their glasses, aristocrats murmuring behind gloved hands, and musicians leaning forward in their seats like students waiting for a masterclass, because Bob Dylan was about to walk on stage. And in that era, Dylan wasn't just a singer. He was a myth in motion, a prophet with a guitar, a man whose words had reshaped the language of music itself. Backstage, however, the atmosphere was very different. Cables snaked across the floor, cigarette smoke curled through narrow hallways. BBC producers whispered about timing and royal protocol, and near an old, upright piano stood Joni Mitchell, arms folded, eyes sharp, watching Dylan not with awe but with quiet, unsettling clarity. She had arrived in London only days earlier, her name still climbing the ladders of recognition. Her songs whispered about in folk circles as dangerously honest, too poetic to be commercial and too emotional to be ignored. And as Dylan finished his soundcheck, playing with that familiar half-smile, half-distance that made audiences feel both invited and excluded at the same time, Joni listened without moving, her expression unreadable. When the final note faded and technicians applauded politely, a young BBC assistant turned to her and said, "He never disappoints, does he?" And Joni, after a moment's pause, replied in a voice so calm it felt almost cruel, "That's not music." A sentence so simple, yet so explosive that the assistant laughed nervously, thinking she was joking, but she wasn't. Within minutes, the words traveled through the backstage corridors like an electric current, carried by whispers and widened eyes, until someone reached Dylan's manager, then a producer, then finally Dylan himself, who was sitting alone on a wooden crate, tuning his guitar with slow, deliberate movements, when a stagehand approached and said, "Bob, Joni Mitchell wants to speak with you." And Dylan looked up, curious rather than offended, because he had heard of her, the Canadian songwriter who wrote lyrics like confessionals and melodies like wounds that refused to heal. He found her near the piano, the echo of distant applause still vibrating through the building, and for a moment neither spoke, two artists studying each other like opponents in a silent duel. "I heard you didn't like the show," Dylan said lightly, his voice casual but his eyes alert. Joni didn't blink. "I didn't say I didn't like it," she replied. "I said it wasn't music." The hallway froze. A producer stopped mid-step. A guitarist forgot what he was tuning. No one dared interrupt, because everyone sensed that something rare was happening. Not a fight, not a scandal, but a collision between two kinds of truth. Dylan tilted his head slightly, studying her as if she were an unfamiliar chord progression. "Then what do you think music is?" he asked. Joni stepped closer, her voice still calm, but sharper now. "Music is what happens when you stop hiding behind your own legend," she said. And for the first time that evening, Dylan didn't have a clever reply. Outside the hallway, the audience waited, unaware that backstage, the mythology of Bob Dylan was being quietly dismantled by a woman who refused to kneel before it. Dylan walked away without another word, but something in his posture had changed, as if a thought he'd avoided for years had finally caught up with him. And when he stepped onto the stage moments later, the crowd erupted in applause, unaware that the man they were cheering was no longer performing out of confidence, but out of confrontation with himself. The first song was familiar, poetic, elusive, exactly what everyone expected, and the audience responded with admiration. But Dylan felt a strange distance between himself and the sound of his own voice, like he was listening to a stranger wearing his face. Backstage, Joni watched from the shadows, not smiling, not clapping, not judging, simply listening. And when Dylan finished and walked off stage, applause trailing behind him like a victory parade, he passed her again in the corridor, their eyes meeting for a fraction of a second, and in that glance was something more dangerous than rivalry, recognition. Moments later, a producer rushed toward Dylan, clipboard shaking in his hands. "Your schedule for one more set," he said breathlessly. "Same songs, same structure. The Queen is still in the hall." Dylan looked past him, toward Joni, who stood quietly near the piano, and for several seconds he said nothing. "No," Dylan finally replied. The producer blinked. "No, I'm changing everything." Panic rippled through the backstage crew. "You can't improvise," someone whispered. "This is a royal event," another warned. "There are protocols." Dylan didn't argue. He simply walked toward the stage, guitar in hand, his expression unreadable, and as he stepped back into the spotlight, the audience prepared for another familiar masterpiece, unaware that they were about to witness something no one, including Dylan himself, had planned. In the front rows, aristocrats leaned back comfortably. Critics adjusted their notebooks. Somewhere in the hall, Queen Elizabeth II sat quietly, her gaze fixed on the stage, expecting art, tradition, excellence, but not revelation. Dylan sat down on a simple wooden chair instead of standing, an unusual choice that created a ripple of confusion through the audience. The band remained silent. The lights dimmed slightly, and then Dylan spoke, not saying, "Someone told me something tonight," he said softly, his voice carrying through the hall without amplification, and the audience leaned forward, sensing something unscripted. "They said what I do isn't music." A murmur spread across the seats. Dylan looked down at his guitar for a long moment, as if searching for an answer not in the instrument, but in himself. Backstage, Joni Mitchell watched without moving. The producers froze. The critics stopped writing. And in that suspended moment, before Dylan played a single note, before anyone understood what was about to happen, history quietly shifted direction, because the man on stage was no longer performing for applause, no longer hiding behind symbolism, no longer playing the role the world had assigned him. He was about to do something far more dangerous than rebellion. He was about to tell the truth. The hall didn't know how to respond when Bob Dylan lifted his head again, because something in his eyes had changed, not the distant confidence audiences were used to, but a quiet intensity that felt almost vulnerable. And when he finally touched the strings of his guitar, the first notes were unfamiliar, raw, stripped of ornament, as if he were playing not for the crowd but against it. The audience waited for metaphor, for poetry wrapped in mystery, but instead Dylan began to sing in a voice that sounded less like performance and more like confession, singing about loneliness in hotel rooms where applause couldn't reach, about waking up to headlines that praised a version of himself he barely recognized, about the fear of becoming a symbol instead of a person. And as the words unfolded, critics slowly lowered their pens, aristocrats leaned forward without realizing it, and musicians in the balcony felt something tighten in their chests, because Dylan wasn't playing the game anymore. He was dismantling it in front of them. Backstage, the producers exchanged terrified glances, whispering that this wasn't in the program, that this wasn't safe, that this wasn't what the Queen had come to hear. But no one dared interrupt, because even they understood that stopping him now would be like interrupting a confession mid-sentence. Joni Mitchell stood near the piano, her arms no longer crossed, her expression no longer skeptical, her eyes fixed on Dylan with a mixture of surprise and something close to respect, because she realized he wasn't trying to prove her wrong. He was trying to answer her honestly. As the song deepened, Dylan's voice cracked, not dramatically but naturally, like a man speaking a truth he'd avoided for years, singing about how fame felt like a mirror that reflected everyone else's expectations instead of his own face, how people loved the myth of Bob Dylan more than the man behind it, and how every new song felt less like creation and more like obligation. The audience felt the shift before they understood it. Applause stopped completely, replaced by a silence so heavy it felt physical, as if the hall itself were holding its breath. And when Dylan reached the final verse, his hands trembled slightly, not from fear but from the weight of what he was revealing, singing that he had built a mask so convincing even he had believed it was real. And when the last chord echoed into the high ceiling of Royal Albert Hall, it didn't fade into applause. It dissolved into something deeper, something unsettling. For several seconds, no one moved, no one clapped, no one whispered. Critics who had spent decades analyzing Dylan's lyrics found themselves unable to explain what they had just heard. Musicians felt as though they had witnessed something sacred rather than entertaining, and in the front rows, aristocrats who had arrived expecting culture and elegance sat frozen, unsure whether etiquette allowed them to applaud honesty. Then, slowly, something unprecedented happened. Queen Elizabeth II rose from her seat, not abruptly, not dramatically, but with deliberate calm, and the audience gasped, because royal protocol did not usually include spontaneous gestures, and yet she didn't clap immediately. She simply looked at Dylan for a long moment, as if trying to understand the man behind the legend, and when she finally began to applaud, softly at first, the hall followed, applause building not from excitement, but from awe. Backstage, Joni Mitchell exhaled quietly, her gaze never leaving the stage, and in that moment she understood something she hadn't expected. She hadn't challenged Dylan to defeat him, she had challenged him to reveal himself, and he had done exactly that. When Dylan stood and bowed slightly, the applause continued, but it felt different now, less like celebration and more like acknowledgement, as if the audience had just witnessed not a performance, but a transformation. And as he walked off stage, passing through the same narrow corridor where the confrontation had begun, Dylan didn't look triumphant. He looked thoughtful, almost shaken, as if he had crossed a line he could never uncross. Joni was waiting near the piano again, the backstage noise swirling around them, and when their eyes met, there was no rivalry left, no challenge, only understanding, because both of them knew that what had just happened on that stage was not planned, not rehearsed, not safe, and that was precisely why it mattered. After the hall emptied and the echoes of applause faded into silence, Bob Dylan didn't join the celebrations or the royal reception. Instead, he sat alone in a quiet corridor behind the stage, guitar resting against the wall, as if the instrument itself had witnessed something it had never been asked to carry before. Joni Mitchell approached slowly, her footsteps soft, her expression no longer sharp, no longer challenging, but thoughtful, and for a long moment neither of them spoke, because words felt smaller than what had just happened. "You were right," Dylan finally said, his voice low, almost reflective. Joni shook her head gently. "No," she replied. "You were brave." Dylan smiled faintly, not with the confidence of a legend, but with the humility of a man who had just seen himself clearly for the first time, and in that moment something shifted between them. Not rivalry, not victory, but mutual respect born from honesty. Years later, critics would argue that night marked the moment Dylan stopped being an untouchable icon and became something far rarer, a human artist willing to risk his myth for truth, while Joni Mitchell would say in interviews that she never meant to provoke him, only to remind him of the music beneath the legend. As for the Queen, royal archives would later reveal a simple handwritten note from that evening, preserved among official documents, containing only a quiet observation. "Tonight, I heard a man sing without disguise." Some performances are remembered for their brilliance, others for their controversy, but that night in London was remembered for something deeper, because in a world obsessed with perfection and image, Bob Dylan chose honesty, Joni Mitchell chose truth, and together, without planning it, they created a moment where music stopped being performance and became revelation. A moment that proved even legends can change, and sometimes, the most powerful sound in history is not applause, but silence.